let me start off with this. We don't have to use the microphones for this. Just kind of say it loudly, and then I'll repeat it, so we can all make sure we've heard it. If a word or a few words kind of come to your mind about what your experience has been with Revelation in your life up until this point, what are those words or phrases? Like what's kind of been our universal collective experience with this book? Weird. Avoidance. Confusing. What else? Really? Like, what else? What other words or phrases or things about would you kind of use to sum up how we've experienced this book? Troubling. Cataclysmic. Couldn't they have made it easier, right? And all God's people said amen. What else? Anyone else? What other words or phrases could we use to describe our experience with this book? Confusing? Encouragement after studying it, which is great, right? Yeah. So there is hope, right? There is some encouragement. There is hope. But sometimes on a first read or on a read where we're not digging into context, it on the surface kind of seems bleak and confusing and even like just gargantuan and kind of strange, right? Let me ask you this. How many of you studied it with us in Word and Worship? How many of you did Revelation? Okay. So about half of us did it, which is great. So those of you who did the study, let me ask kind of y'all just a question. We're kind of getting our bearings. We're acclimating to what we're going to do. Was your experience reading about Revelation enhanced by doing the study of Revelation? Was it helpful? Okay, good. Do those of you who studied it sense more hope now than you did? Okay, good. That's great. So there's encouragement for those of us who haven't studied it recently that there is hope within this book. I promise there's hope and there's joy and there's actually encouragement in the text of Revelation. So what I want to do, because this is a teaching method that I don't use super often, but it proves helpful, I think, in this particular scenario, is I want to walk us through what Revelation is not, and then we'll walk through what Revelation is. And then we're going to talk about apocalyptic literature, because unless we can get our arms around apocalyptic literature, Revelation has the potential to continue to be somewhat frightening, confusing, jarring, alarmist, those types of things. So we're going to talk about what Revelation is not first, because I think sometimes it's good to know what something is not. So we kind of like purge ourselves of these thoughts that a lot of us have been carrying around. Let me give you, before we jump into this list, let me give you a little bit of my personal background with this book. I grew up in kind of a Baptist, non-denominational, evangelical world, right? Where any discussion about Revelation was generally couched in terms of something about Left Behind, which I can't even begin to tell you how damaging Left Behind and things like Late Great Planet Earth, how damaging those texts have been to biblical studies around Revelation and to our churches. Not because they're bad books, but because they're fiction that's been couched as actually the Bible, and they're not. And so we have to kind of purge ourselves of some of that sometimes. Again, it's fiction. I'm not telling you don't read those things, but make sure that you realize if you read those things that it's purely fiction, right? It's not the Bible. And we assimilated, certain denominations really heavily assimilated those types of views that are laid out in those books as biblical and as the only view, and it did a lot of damage. I talked to a lot of people who just have a lot of struggles, and even some church hurt around Revelation, that just because of how aggressively it was taught, or how just the harshness of it was really frightening to them. So I grew up in kind of Baptist, non-denominational, evangelical places where that was kind of the pulse of it. It was, more about what's your position on the millennium? That was really the thing that everyone wanted to chat about, and I just don't care. I do not care. But that was kind of where I came from. So let's talk about what Revelation is not, so we can then set ourselves up to examine what Revelation is, And then we'll talk about the type of literature that we're looking at, because all of those things are really important. So, first and foremost, if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open them up to Revelation chapter 1. Let's get the text in front of us and kind of easily accessible to us. Now, those of you who studied Revelation with me through Word and Worship, you will know this because I talked about it a lot. And yet, some of you still send me emails that indicate you were not listening. So I'm going to say it again in the presence of all these witnesses, and in the presence of people who did not study Revelation with us. Revelation is not called Revelations. It's not the name of the book. There is no book in the Bible called Revelations. Stop putting an S at the end of it. There's no book called Revelations in the Bible. So stop. Like, it doesn't exist. It's not there. The book is called Revelation. John had one revelation, not many revelations, okay? So we laugh at that, but I can't tell you how many people send me emails. I really loved that Revelations study we did in Word and Worship. And I feel completely devastated because I'm like, they didn't understand anything. Like, they missed all that I've said. So anyways, it's not called Revelations. It's called Revelation. Revelation is not a code to be deciphered. It's not a code to be deciphered. Your textbook picks up on this, kind of examines it a little bit. It is not a code to be deciphered. It's not this like map or like a key or a legend on a map where if we could just unlock what the symbols mean, we could somehow figure out everything that's going to happen in our future. That is not the purpose of Revelation. That's not the purpose of apocalyptic literature. That's not what's going on here. It is not a code to be deciphered, okay? It kind of in the same vein of that, it is not a one-to-one correlation for upcoming world events. It is not a one-to-one correlation for upcoming world events. Again, it's not like a blueprint that we can just kind of lay over world events and say, oh, there we go. Let me not predict what's going to happen here. Let me predict That's not what Revelation does. That's not what apocalyptic literature is doing. It is not something that we can just kind of like map out. Well, if we could only just get to this point in world history, then all these events would like unlock and start happening and Jesus would come back. That's not what's happening here. It's not about America, sort of, with a caveat, a really big caveat. But I've talked to so many people who are convinced that somehow and for some reason America is the center of the Bible. And everything in it points to us, which is par for the course, really, in some ways. But I talked to so many people who are like, yeah, we're the good guys, and like Russia, we're waiting for them to rise up, and then Jesus will come back. No, that is not the purpose or the story of Revelation. And we do ourselves a great damage when we read the Bible and we fail to ever see ourselves collectively as the bad guys. Pay attention if we only ever read the Bible and see ourselves in a good light, because that's typically not how the Bible works. So it's not about America, sort of. It's not a story about the destruction of the world. It's not a story about the destruction of the world. It's not a narrative where at the end of it, everything is like laid waste and the earth is destroyed with fire and it's just like, poof, it's all burned up. And then we somehow float off to heaven, and live with Jesus. It's not a story of total destruction. It absolutely is not a story of total destruction. The last few chapters confirm that it's not a story of destruction. It's not impossible to understand. I know some of you in your reading comments were like really encouraged and excited about Revelation, and some of you were like, I still don't get it, and I honestly don't even really understand why it's in the Bible. Those are valid places to be, so it's totally fine. But I promise you, it's not impossible to understand, and I hope that for everyone who raised their hand and kind of nodded yes, that those of us who have studied Revelation recently together, there's a sense of like encouragement that the book now holds for us. And it's not this foreboding. And we feel like we can get our arms around it a little bit better. We still have questions. But for everyone who raised their hand and said, yeah, I just recently studied it in Word and Worship, and it actually makes sense a little bit more now, and it actually encourages me. I hope that gives you hope if you haven't studied it recently. It's not something we should be afraid of. Again, I feel like some of the words that we shared a few minutes ago, like foreboding or, just confusing or even like malicious or something like that. We don't have to have that outlook on Revelation because that's not the overall story. It's not a story that we need to be afraid of. It's not a narrative that should promote angst and like anxiety in us. It doesn't have to, and it's not the purpose of it, I would argue. It's an aggressive book against things that are not of God, but it's not an aggressive book against the people of God or against the things of God. So Revelation is none of these things. So it's kind of, I know a lot of us, myself included, kind of held on to some of these things for a long time, kind of in my growing up and in my learning. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of like take all this baggage and we're just going to kind of drop it. We're just going to like, okay, put all that behind us as best we can. Kind of drop these frameworks that a lot of us have heard and grown up with around the book of Revelation. And let's look at what Revelation actually is. It's an apocalyptic vision written with heavy references to the Old Testament. Revelation is an apocalyptic vision. We're going to unpack what that means a little bit more in a second, with heavy references to the Old Testament. You don't really understand Revelation unless you have a really decent grasp of the Old Testament. It is heavy with pointing backwards and saying, just like this, when this happened, that's what's going to keep happening. Or remember how God treated Egypt? Still how God's going to react to governments and systems that are anti-God. You remember when God did this? Still in the business of doing that. It is heavy with Old Testament references. And again, we kind of miss what's happening at the end of Revelation if we don't get what's happening at the beginning of God's story. Okay, so we got to have a grasp of the Old Testament. It is a tool to help us see things as they truly are. It's a tool to help us see things as they truly are. Revelation, by definition of the word apocalypse and apocalyptic, which we're going to unpack more in a second, by definition, pulls back the curtain that this world tries to kind of pull over our eyes and says, no, let's actually look into God's space. Let's look at how God is viewing the world. Let's look at how God's story plays out here. And so it actually kind of gives us different lenses, different goggles with which to see what is actually happening. It kind of shocks us out of our complacency within the systems of this world and says, no. You don't have to live like that because God's kingdom is not like that. So let's let you see what God's kingdom is actually like. Let's let you see how God is reacting and responding to the evils in this world, lest you be lulled into sleep by them. So it gives us a picture of how things really are. Kind of in that same vein is it gives us, it's an unveiling of things that we can't understand on our own. It's an unveiling of things we can't understand on our own. What do you mean by that? Well, again, we need different goggles. We need new lenses to see and understand how God sees and understands the world. That's not our natural position, right? That's not our natural prescription, if we're going to run with the lenses metaphor. Our natural prescription is tainted by sin. It's tainted by the systems of this world. It's tainted by things that are very, very anti-God. It's tainted by our own misunderstandings of God, and just all these things. So we need a new prescription. So Revelation gives us the prescription that we lack the ability to get on our own, and it reveals things that we otherwise wouldn't be able to grasp. It reveals things like the just messed upness of the systems of this world that we benefit from often. It reveals to us how systems of oppression are just consistent throughout world history and how we as Christians are called to live differently. Again, this is not our natural prescription, right? We need God to kind of, just as the Spirit regenerates us through salvation and sanctification and justification and all those things, part of that is beginning to see the world as God sees it. That's part of that process, and Revelation unlocks that a little bit for us. It is, in many ways, a summation of all the stories in the Scriptures. In many ways, again, remember with me, it is very Old Testament. It's very Old Testament. So we're seeing the direction this whole enterprise has been moving since the beginning, and it gives us this beautiful kind of trajectory and says, hey, this is where this whole thing has been moving this whole time, for millennia. Since Genesis 1, page 1, chapter 1, verse 1, this is where the enterprise has been going. This is the direction that God is taking God's people, that God is taking the entire cosmos, and this is how you participate in it. That's the story. So it really is, in many ways, a summation of all the stories, a summation of explaining what God has been up to, why God has been up to it. It offers us, the fancy word for this is a telos. It offers us kind of an end goal, like an end point that we're all moving towards for a reason. It offers that to us and says, here is why you can have hope. Here is why you should follow Jesus. Here's how God is going to save the world and rid it of all evil and sin and the stain of death and all those things and all the evil systems that participate in that. Here is how God will do this. And again, it's couched in apocalyptic language, right? And so it feels kind of strange to us. We don't really have apocalyptic literature. It's not something that we, as 21st century Westerners, are familiar with. Jews back in this time, apocalyptic literature was like a branch. Like you could literally go into the library almost, and there'd be like an Jewish apocalyptic literature section. Like there was so much of it because it was a common writing style. Like it was how they told stories. It was how they conveyed messages. So let's talk about what is an apocalypse. What does this word mean? Let me explain this right off the bat. The word apocalypse does not mean the destruction of something. That is not what the word means in this context. So like movies like Apocalypse Now, or like Independence Day even, or other movies like where like great calamities are rising and like the world is threatening to be destroyed unless like we can somehow like fight our way out of it. Like that's not what the word apocalypse means in its biblical context regarding biblical narrative. That's not this genre of writing. It doesn't mean like the total destruction of something. That's not what this is. Now we have a lot of movies about, like cataclysmic events or like apocalyptic events. And we use that word, and typically when we use that word, we mean something really big that affects pretty much all of humankind has happened to the world, and we might not make it. Like that's what we mean when we say that word typically. That's not what it means in this context, which again should hopefully some of us take a deep breath when it comes to Revelation. Like it's not scary in that way. It's from a Greek word. So it actually, if you open your Bibles, you have it in front of you. You're looking in English, obviously, but where it says in verse 1 of chapter 1, the revelation from Jesus Christ, that word is actually the word apocalypse. It's an apocalypse from Jesus or of Jesus, depending on how you want to render that. But that word there is apocalypse. So that should tell us something about what the word revelation actually means. And that it's to uncover, to disclose, to reveal, to pull back the curtain, to give us the correct prescription lenses. Whichever one of those images is going to help you best kind of lock it in your brain, that's what's happening here. This word apocalypse means to uncover, to reveal. Again, going back to this idea of like, if we could just see with the right lenses, somehow if we could see with God's lenses, somehow like things would begin to click into place and we'd see the world for what it actually is. It's an uncovering, it's a revealing of God's plan, of how God is operating, that we don't naturally just kind of see on our own. We're not really tuned in sometimes to God's like dimension of things. So it helps us see that. It is an apocalypse. It is an uncovering, a revealing, a disclosing of things. Another interesting thing about apocalypse is in this particular scenario, an apocalypse is something that happens to you. You don't apocalypse something for yourself. Like it has to be revealed. You don't apocalypse something for yourself in the way that this word works here. It has to happen to you. Again, going back to this idea that we as kind of broken human beings who are kind of caught between the human plane of ways of seeing things and God's plane and ways of seeing things, we're kind of caught between if you're a Christian. We can't fully understand and see God's plan unless it is revealed to us. Like we're not going to stumble into that accidentally on our own, like under our own power. It has to be revealed to us. Something has to be apocalypsed to you, to me, to understand what's actually going on. So apocalypse is this type of genre of literature. These are some facts about it, but some other facts about it are things like this. It typically employs like big, grandiose, jarring images to convey a point. It is meant to grab your attention, right? It is meant to kind of shock us out of complacency, our normal everyday kind of going through the motions, our normal understanding of something. Apocalyptic literature, generally speaking, has some pretty intense imagery. It employs almost like a poetic kind of like, I'm going to grab your attention. It's very aggressive sometimes, at least that's how we perceive it, with the purpose of saying, hey, pay attention. Pay attention. Pay attention. This is important. You need to understand how things are actually happening. You need to understand the message of what's going on here. So something is apocalypse to us, and we're usually, when we approach Revelation, we kind of go, whoa, these are some really strange images, and I don't understand how this works, and this is kind of even like a little bit jarring, and it's kind of scary even, and so I'm just going to I'm going to close it and be like, I don't have to deal with that. Like, I don't understand, so I'm going to step back. Let me encourage you by saying this. Turn over to Revelation chapter 5. This is, if you want to know what the heartbeat of Revelation is, Revelation chapter 5 is really like the heartbeat of it, because this is where we get a picture of the throne room of God. This is where the Lamb is revealed to us. It really gives us the energy for the book. It demonstrates the worship of God and of the Lamb. It tells us that the Lamb is the only one who's worthy to open the scroll. This seems really strange. So take a look at verse 6 of chapter 5. It's coming right on the heels of John the seer is given this vision of heaven, and this angel says, hey, look, here's this scroll that we need to open in order to kind of get a picture of what God's plan is. And John starts crying because there's no one who is worthy to open the scroll being this image of God's plan, of God's way of doing things. And the angel's like, don't cry, buddy, it's going to be okay. And then take a look at verse 6. It says, then I saw a lamb looking as if it had been slain, standing in the center of the throne, encircled by the 4 living creatures and the elders. The lamb had 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. Let's just stop right there because it's already weird enough. Now, here's what I want you to remember. Who or what is the lamb? Jesus. Is Jesus literally a lamb? Good answer, no. So be careful when you start reading all of the other creatures in Revelation as literal. Okay? Just FYI. Like, we're very comfortable with the image of Jesus as a lamb, and that being used as like a metaphor of like this humble, weak, helpless, slain, sacrificial creature, right? We're used to that because we're Christians, and that's common in our jargon, right? But when we start getting to the beast and the dragon, we're like, oh my gosh, I don't know what's happening. Just remember, tell yourself, is Jesus literally a lamb? No. So that kind of, again, takes some of the pressure off of trying to interpret, like, well, why is there a dragon? And why is there this beast? And why does this one have horns? And this, just calm down for a second. We don't have to interpret what every single facet of this thing means, because typically in apocalyptic literature, sometimes the message is not in decoding weird aspects of what was used to describe the beast. It's just saying, do you understand what the beast actually is? Not do you understand and can you name what the 7 horns mean? Sometimes in apocalyptic literature, that doesn't even matter. It's just creating an image that will jar you into focusing on what the narrative is actually saying. And we get so focused on I got to figure out what this beast actually looked like, and we miss what the beast actually is, which is the spirit of the empire and the agents through which governments take over and disrespect God and all the things that Revelation tells us about over and over and over again. And we're like, but what does the right eye mean? That is not the point. That is not the point. And so we get so caught up in the weeds, we miss the forest for the trees, and we get so caught up in these in the minutia. And this is where a lot of us have probably gotten tripped up with Revelation, or heard really, really bad sermons about Revelation, or done really, really bad studies on Revelation, where we just want to focus and be like, what do these locusts actually mean? Who are they? Are they? I heard one time, Lord help her, she was doing her best, as we all are. I'm sure I'll look back on this 5 years from now and be like, I should have said something different, which I feel that way all the time. As we should. We should grow and learn, right? But I had a teacher, in elementary school or middle school one time, tell us that the locusts, there's a really intense picture of locusts in there that have people's heads and horses by. It's weird. They're not normal locusts, okay? And she told us that those locusts were actually Israeli fighter jets. No. Come on. No, they're not. Okay? So like, again, we get so caught up sometimes in trying to like decode. Remember, it's not something that we have to decode. It's not like this, if I could just figure out the right like symbolism for this, then something that would magically unlock. No, like there's a definite like storyline that runs through Revelation that if we can get our arms around, I think it begins to actually settle us. And it begins to make things make sense a little bit more. Okay, so let's stop right there for a second. Let's talk about what we've just talked about. We haven't actually like opened the book yet and started looking at it, but given what it's not, what it is, discussions about apocalyptic literature, let's kind of stop right there and catch our breath and talk about that aspect of things. Yes, back there. Can we get a microphone to the back table? Thank you.
It's on.
It should be on.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
I have two questions.
Yes.
Okay, so you just said the thing about the empire. Can you just say, so the beast represents not Satan, but the quote empire?
Yeah, so let's just go ahead and look at that. Let's just all open your Bibles to Revelation chapter 12. Chapter 12 and 13 give us some clues into this. Also, while we're here, let me recommend two books to y'all that are really just great, handy books to have. The first one is called A Companion to the Book of Revelation by David Mathewson. A Companion to the Book of Revelation by David Mathewson. This is an easy book to read. It's short, it's sweet. He walks through kind of just the chapters. He just walks through the book in order. Great resource, easy to read. Like just good information here. The other one that I always recommend is called Reading Revelation Responsibly by Michael Gorman. This is one of the books I recommend most often. It's such a great resource. Reading Revelation Responsibly by Michael Gorman. The subtitle, which is great, is Uncivil Worship and Witness, Following the Lamb into the New Creation. It's a great subtitle. But this is another fantastic book. Okay, so here's something that I've learned about people in the church. And this is to answer your question, Tracy. This is the long way around because this is where we were going to go anyway, so you set it up perfectly. Then we'll do more questions in a second. Here's something I've learned about people in the church that blows my mind, and yet I can understand why it is this way. There is like this weird obsession. I feel pretty comfortable using that word obsession with Satan. Like there's a weird like vibe about him. And I don't understand why. I do understand why, but it needn't be that way. So let's unpack that for a second because it really plays into chapters 12 and 13, which talk about the beast and the dragon, right? So in Hebrew culture, which the book, your textbook does a great job of catching this, you don't have like Satan as an individual being. There's no capital S proper name Satan. For a long time, like it doesn't really exist in the Hebrew Bible. Every time you see the word Satan, it's actually ha-Satan in Hebrew, which is the Satan, little s. Just means the accuser, one who accuses, the spirit of accusation. It's not an individual character. It's not a pronoun. It's not a name. It's not a proper name. It's just a title. It's not even a person or a being. It's simply a title, the accuser, the one who accuses, the spirit that is of accusation, right? So not until like much later do we get like this formation of the idea of there actually being like a capital S, like quote, person, okay? And if you have questions about this, we're going to have to talk about that another night. I don't have time to unpack all of this right now because we got to process through. I'm just kind of giving you a real quick background. So not until much later in biblical history, and even just in world history, do we get an idea of some like capital S proper name figure, okay? Which is why your textbook, if you noticed, especially in this chapter in Revelation, it talks about the Satan, little s. Did you pick up on that? Yeah. So you have throughout the scriptures, especially in the Old Testament, even in the book of Job, it's you have this like character, but it's a function to accuse, right? And Job is super old and super in line, and we've studied the Old Testament together. Job has very like mythological vibes. I'm not saying that as like, oh, it's not true, but it is written in a certain genre, right? Okay, much like Revelation. So anyways, we got to understand what we're dealing with when we talk about this idea of the accuser, the Satan. Because they back then did not have the ideas that we have now. That's not the spirit they write in. So anyways, typically kind of what is kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? I just went blank. How this seeps in, really, is this kind of idea of like one figure begins to form. Remember how I told you when we did the lesson where we covered the period between the Testaments, between the Old and New Testament, and I reminded you, I said, hey, remember with me, friends, that Socrates and Plato, they predated Jesus, right? They lived and died several hundreds of years before Jesus. Well, our good friend Plato, God bless him, he was a very smart person, but he had some interesting thoughts. One was very, very, just very pervasive to us even today, and that's this idea of like dualism. What I mean by that, I'm going to kind of pull out a little bit of what he said, and if you're a Plato person, you know that there's a whole lot more in the background of this, but I'm going to kind of like pull it out and really just like give us what we need for now. The church and Christians have really like clung on to this idea for worse. There's not even, I don't think, a for better side of that coin. And we've kind of somehow in our brains, I don't know that we would actually say this if we were asked to explain it and really like think about what we were saying, but a lot of us had this picture of like Satan being God's archenemy, okay? And of like there being this like dualistic like it's them against each other and like, you know, something like that, which is so not the story of the Bible. Like God is king, and that's about it. Like there's not this like, who's going to win? Like, I don't know. Like they're pitted against each. Like there's none of that. Like it's just God's going to win and evil's going to be defeated. And evil didn't even really ever have a shot, right? Ultimately. So anyways, what we have in Revelation, when we come to Revelation, is you have this, it's almost like when you talk about Jesus on the cross, you have this like gathering of evil that gets poured out on Jesus, right? All of just the everything that the world and its systems of sin and all of our just messiness as people gets thrown on Jesus and poured out on Jesus, and he takes it all in on himself, and he accepts it, and he takes it all down to the grave, to the lowest place that it can take him, the most powerful thing it can do to him, and he beats it from the inside out, right? Remember we talked about that? So what you have in Revelation is kind of a retelling of that story almost. And what I mean by that is you have this kind of just gathering of darkness and of evil, of everything that Revelation has built up to this point as telling us is anti-God's kingdom. So the spirit of Babylon, the spirit of Rome, the spirit of power, the spirit of violence, the spirit of all these things that Revelation talks about over and over and over and over again, just gets like heaped up into this grand image of Babylon, which is kind of the name placeholder for all earthly evil systems and governments, right? So you have like Babylon and Rome and Egypt and all kind of like these like big ones from the Bible are symbolically represented by Babylon, right? And so you get to chapter 12 and to chapter 13 where you get this figure of the dragon, right? And we understand that to be the Satan, the accuser, okay? We're even told, like this later in the book, this is how it gets played out. And the Satan, this figure, this kind of, I use the word energy. I don't mean like woo-woo, like woo energy. I don't mean like that. I mean like, you know what I mean. Like the systems of evil that power this world that we all feel the ramifications of on a daily basis, right? The systems of evil that cause like sin and that death is the ultimate like image of, like those things that are just powered and generated by just evil. Like remember how Paul tells us, hey, there's actually like spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Remember that? Like that evil that just kind of energizes and gives rise to these evil systems and systems of power and governments like Babylon, right? And some of you are like, I have no idea what you're talking about right now. And hopefully those of you who studied Revelation with us earlier are kind of like, oh yeah, I kind of remember that. So anyways, chapter 12, we get this picture of the dragon, right? Now remember with me, is Jesus actually a lamb? No, okay? So is this evil like energy and systems and all this, is it actually literally a dragon? No. A dragon, think about what John could possibly use as the scariest, most intimidating image to grab the attention of his readers to go, hey, pay attention. I don't know of much better than a dragon. They pop up in a lot of like myths that the Greeks and the Romans would have been very familiar with, right? So he's writing to audiences who would have been like, oh yeah, we know about the dragons. We know that like that's bad. Like never is the dragon good. Maybe like in Puff the Magic Dragon, right? But like never is a dragon good like back in the day. Like in myth, in the Bible stories, none of that. So you get this dragon that kind of symbolizes all of this just evil, the demonic evil forces of the world, the accuser, the Satan, like this like just everything that is anti-God, right? So this is what we get in Revelation chapter 12 with the dragon. That is symbolically also Rome and Babylon and like the personification of evil, right? So take a look at chapter 12, verse 1. We're going to read a lot, so we'll just kind of internalize the story because it is a story and the writing is beautiful. Like it'll grab your attention. Like it makes great like storytelling because it's fantastic, right? It says, a great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars in her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. If you haven't studied Revelation recently, this is Israel. This woman is Israel, okay, as a people group. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon. Again, is there actually literally a woman? Is there actually literally a dragon? No. John the seer is using imagery to tell us a story. Right? That's what good storytellers do. He's grabbing our attention and saying, I'm going to use this imagery to tell you something true about God and to tell you something true about how God is operating in the world, but I need to do it in a way that's really going to get your attention and in a way that's going to kind of pull back the veil, okay? Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child in the moment it was born. Now, there is a Greek or Roman myth, I don't remember which, at the time floating around, John was writing this, is it Apollo? I just went blank on who it is. On one of the big mythological individuals, right? I'm sorry, I just went blank. And in that story, the serpent is warned that, hey, the child that's going to be born is going to destroy you, okay? So there's like this other myth floating around that the people that John's writing to would have been very familiar with. So John says, I'm going to take that and I'm going to spin it on its head because in the myth that was floating around, Rome comes out looking really good. The evil system that is Rome, that is evil earthly governments, comes out on looking good because it destroys the serpent, right, in the myth. And John uses that myth and flips it completely on his head and paints Rome as the one who will be destroyed. Now, hang with me. The dragon stood in front of the woman about to give birth. Verse 5, she gave birth to a son, a male child who, quote, will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, Jesus. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Now, this whole like time thing in Revelation, we just need to cool our jets on. Like just everyone needs to take a deep breath. Main things to know, and I would be happy to expound more upon this for you through an email or through whatever if you have questions. Happy to answer some more questions. There's also, I think, multiple lectures posted from Revelation that we did for Word and Worship where you can go, like, if you're like, I want to know more about chapter 12, like, you can go watch the lecture from chapter 12. This whole, like, 1,260, 40 years, 40 days, like, they're all a way of pretty much saying the same thing. They operated on a lunar calendar back then, and that's how you get some of these weird numbers, because if you did it on our calendar or another calendar, you'd be like, the math doesn't add up. That's because they operated on a different calendar. But this is a way of saying, this 1,260, or if you see the number 40, these are good round numbers that people really loved back then, but they're a way of saying this is a definite, it's not indefinite, this is a definite time period that will come to an end. There is an end in sight. It might be kind of long, it might be uncomfortable, but FYI, encouragement to the churches, this will have an end. This is not an indefinite thing, okay? And then, verse 7, then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, yada, yada, yada. We have this, like, whole battle. Then verse 10, now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser, that should sound really familiar. And note that it's not capitalized, it's not a proper title, it's not Satan, it's the accuser, ha-Satan, the accuser, the original like spirit of evil and the original enemy of God insofar as it works against God's people, of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. We have this great worship. Worship just erupts in Revelation all the time. Like, we'll just be going about the story like beep, bop, boop, boop, bop, and then all of a sudden just worship just erupts. Once people begin to see, and when heaven and earth begin to come closer and closer and closer together, and worship just explodes. Now, verse 13, when the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the two wings of a great eagle. That's Exodus imagery. That's Old Testament imagery. So that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness. Old Testament imagery of the wilderness is a place where God meets his people. Yep, that's there. And then time, half a time. Again, I don't have time to unpack all of this. We're not teaching like all of Revelation right now. Keep going in chapter 12. He's going to try to overtake the woman. Verse 16, but the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of its mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keeps the commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. Okay, so if we want to talk about, quote, Satan in the way that we kind of collectively have come to understand, Revelation paints him in chapter 12. Again, I argue with that take on Satan, but just collectively, that's kind of what we're comfortable with, so I'm going to roll with it. That's who's painted in chapter 12, the dragon, right? The accuser, the energy. Again, I don't mean like woo, like energy. I mean like the systems of evil that power everything that is anti-God, okay? Which again, I think we can all kind of get our arms around that because we live in a broken world and we see those systems, right? We see anti-God things happening all the time, right? So the energy that powers those things, again, the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places, all of that, is kind of like wrapped up in a nice, neat package. Could I say that about what we just read? A nice, neat package in chapter 12. Now, it gets even better, or worse, depending on how you look at it. Chapter 13 tells us that this dragon, the Satan, the accuser, whatever you want to call him for now, and that's fine. I'm not here to argue that with you. That this dragon stands on the shore of the sea. Now remember with me, the sea is, someone tell me what the sea represents. Those of you who know, chaos. This place of chaos, this place that is, again, anti-God. God is a God of order. God is a God of setting things to rights. So the sea, when we start talking about like apocalyptic literature and imagery, is typically not a great place, which is why later in Revelation we're told that the sea is no more. It's not that God doesn't love water. It's not that God didn't create water. It's that the proverbial place that we kind of use as an imagery of chaos and unknowing and evil is no more in the new heavens and new earth. Back to chapter 13. This is like, we're going rapid fire at this point because we got to get through this and I want to do the rest of y'all's questions and comments. The dragon, who's like just the complete pinnacle of all of these evil systems, stands on the shore of the sea, the place of chaos, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. Now we're getting back into some Old Testament imagery. Think Daniel. This is very like Daniel-esque, talking about these beasts, right? And it had 10 horns, 7 heads, 10 crowns on its 10 horns. This is like, these two beasts that we're about to encounter are really like a conglomeration of all of the images we get in Daniel. Like John the seer was like, all those things in Daniel, I'm going to make them into one thing. That's really what happens here. 10 crowns, and then the beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear. This is very Daniel-esque. This is Daniel imagery. Daniel is apocalyptic in some places, right? Here we go, verse 3. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. Some people think that's Nero, because some people think that Nero, like, kind of faked his death and then was going to come back. We don't know what that means, so if you want to jump into that, by all means, there's a lot of interesting things happening there. Historically, it's a fascinating thing to study. I don't know the answer to it, is what I'm saying. So please don't ask me about it because I don't know. The whole world, now pay attention, because this should sound a little familiar to us based on our human experience, collective experience. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. Who powers the beast? Go back to chapter 13, verse 1. Who powers the beast? The dragon. Who powers the beast? The systems of evil and oppression and all of those evil forces in the heavenly realms, all of that energy, again, not woo-woo energy, but like that spirit that drives it, what fuels it, that is what gives power and gives authority and gives the allure to the beasts. Now, this is beast number 1, remember. Take a look at verse 3. They all are filled with wonder and followed the beast. Verse 4, people worshipped the dragon because of the beast, because he had given authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast and asked, who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it? So people are enamored with the beast who is powered by the dragon. Why? Because he's powerful and he's authoritative, right? And there's almost this kind of air of, and he gives us confidence. It makes us feel secure because he's powerful, right? Now, this beast, we're told in verse 5, was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise authority for 42 months. Again, nice round number. Again, a way of saying this has an end date. This will not be indefinite. God will put an end to this. You can go into all the numerology. It's, again, another deep dive that people can do. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and all those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so that's beast number 1. Now, remember, beast number 1 comes from the sea. It's powered by the dragon, right? And a lot of historians, scholars, myself included, and again, if you disagree with this, it's fine. Like, Revelation, for some reason, really, like, makes people bristle or makes people uncomfortable or makes people feel like we have to, like, argue and fight, and we don't. Like, if you're like, I don't read that way, that's fine. Like, you are allowed to do that. A lot of scholars and historians and biblical researchers believe that this first beast that we've encountered, we have the dragon, then the dragon gives power and authority to these 2 beasts, one of whom we haven't met yet. This first beast represents empirical power, okay? Like big E, empirical power, like Roman Empire power, spirit of energy of Babylonian Empire power that is far-reaching, that is just like infiltrating all of pretty much their known world for the most part, right? And then we come to verse 11 and we get a second beast, okay? Take a look at this. Now remember, the first beast comes out of the sea, the second beast comes out of the land, which is interesting to note. The second beast comes out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. Pay attention. This is John saying, pay attention. Because what imagery has he used to represent Jesus? A lamb. This should like jar us into like a little bit of concern perhaps internally. Like, what are we in our society, in our world, in our daily lives, in our personal lives, thinking is a lamb but is actually a dragon? Like, that's a really poignant question, right? That's a harsh reality to consider. What has society or earthly governments or even like us in our misunderstanding or our misalignment or our disordered loves, like what around us are we painting as a lamb or being told as a lamb or being told represents Christ, but is actually a dragon? And we would all have different answers to that question, and we would all probably disagree on some of that actually. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf. So who's powering the second beast? No. What did we just read? Verse 12, it exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf. Okay? So you have the dragon who's giving power to the first beast who represents like Big E Empire. Big E Empire is just a way of saying all things that are anti-God, really. Then you have the second beast who comes out of the land representing a more localized form of this type of empire, a more localized government, local agents of the empire. And he has his authority given to him by the first beast. And he makes his inhabitants, he makes all the people in his power worship the first beast. And it gives great signs and causes fire to come down from heaven. So these beasts have power, right? These systems and these ways of living in the world that are powered by this type of, again, energy. Please don't send me an email and be like, ooh, Laurien, you went really woo-woo. I don't mean woo-woo energy, okay? I mean like the spirit, like the fuel right, is power, and they're powerful. They do many signs. They can make things happen. They're movers and shakers. They have the money. They got the power. They can do things, right? And we're told, hey, the second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so the image could speak. All these weird things, right? This is just a way of saying, hey, pay attention. Like, this is not to be messed with. Like, this is not something we can just be like, don't need to worry about that. No big deal. John's painting a really, like, intense image. Like, this is like sci-fi stuff, right? And then, of course, at the end of chapter 13, we get just, oh my gosh, we get this verse. This calls for wisdom, and you're like, yeah, it does. For real. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for its number is a man, the number 666. Everyone just take a deep breath. I know we just read that verse, and everyone's like, oh my gosh. It's fine. It's really fine. It's not a big deal. Everyone just, again, Hollywood has made things in Revelation a big deal that aren't. Like, it's like half a verse. It's not even a whole verse, right? It's like the millennia. It takes up like 2-3 verses, and we all are like, oh my gosh, I don't know what's happening. It is not the point of Revelation in any shape, way, or form. A lot of people think that this, if you do the numerology, which is very common back then, it works out to being Nero Caesar, who was what was he? He was a representative of Big E Empire, working in the world against God's people, against the things of God. All the things that we just read about are like personified in this individual and have been personified in countless individuals since him who acted just like he did, right? That's chapter 12 and 13. There's a lot more in chapter 12 and 13. And I would encourage you, if you're really interested, go watch the Word and Worship lectures on chapter 12 and 13, because they go into a little bit more depth, right? Because I had a little bit more time. But what I want us to take away is, remember, what I told you was the heartbeat of Revelation chapter 5, that centers us on the throne room of God in heaven, right? And on the Lamb as the victorious slain one who has all authority and power and is worshipped along with the one on the throne because they're the same person, right? So if that's the heartbeat of Revelation, when we come to chapters like 12 and 13, where it gets really weird, and we're like, horns and eyes and heads and power and dragons and beasts and lions and tigers and bears, oh my, like, what are we going to do? Just remember, yes, it's tricky. I'm not saying it's not. It's like shocking, absolutely. But remember, if you ever get like frustrated in Revelation, or if you get even intimidated in Revelation, just go back to chapter 5 and remember, at the center of everything, even as we speak in this very moment, the center of the universe, the center of the cosmos is Jesus. And he's on the throne right now as we speak. And he is reigning and ruling, and the world is moving in a direction of him setting things right eventually, even though it doesn't feel like it, even though it doesn't look like it. So I always try to encourage people, if Revelation starts to get dark and even scary sometimes, which it is, like, it's weird, y'all. It's strange. Just remember, the heartbeat of Revelation is chapter 5, where we see who is actually on the throne, and we see the one who really has all the power. This is not a dualistic, cosmic battle between good and evil, and we're left like biting our nails going, I don't know what's going to happen. No. It is like set. It is sealed. It is sure. Revelation is, again, revealing to us. It is peeling back the layers of the curtains to say, hey, pay attention. Make sure that you aren't participating in these earthly systems. Because they're very alluring, because they offer power, they offer security, they offer military might, they offer all the things that we want to feel secure and safe, but they always have a price that they ask you. Make sure that you do not give in to. That is the message of Revelation. It said, hey, remember who's on the throne. It's not the dragon, it's not the beast, it's not these earthly kingdoms. Do not worship them. Do not give them your allegiance. They are not the kingdom of God. Pay attention. Again, this apocalyptic imagery. Pay attention, pay attention, pay attention, right? Okay, that's chapter 12 and 13. Again, there's so much more in there. I promise you. Like, it's wild, y'all. But let's pause right there. Tracy, did that help? Let's get those mics back on. Abel, are the mics on? Are we good? Try you.
Hello.
There we go. Okay.
So the beast is Satan.
That hurt. That hurt almost as bad as when people call it Revelations.
Revelations.
Right?
Right. Okay, yes, that did help. That was a long answer to a short question.
We were going to go there anyway, so I was like, might as well do it now.
I'm just kidding. Okay, my other question really fast was, in the beginning you said, Revelation is not a one-to-one correlation for world events, and I was going to ask, would anyone say that Daniel would ever be?
Great question. Great question. So Daniel definitely has some different vibes, right? Because in Daniel, we actually get God explaining, like the statue, remember that has like the feet and like we actually get a picture of God saying, and these are the governments that will come, and then I will topple them, right? So we get a little bit more explanation in the apocalyptic imagery of Daniel, where Daniel is writing more. Again, he's using the apocalyptic style to say, pay attention, let me shock you out of this. But God actually gives Daniel, and Daniel then communicates to us like actual like ways to understand what he's writing about, almost like it's like apocalypse meets like history, and they kind of like together. So yes, it's a different style kind of that we get with Daniel.
So some apocalyptic literature can be correlated.
Yeah,
to world
Daniel, we
events, but-
definitely get more of that vibe of seeing like there are these empires, right? That like you have Persia, Greece, Babylon, Rome, all these empires that God warns Daniel and says, hey, pay attention. But I would say that the ethos, like the energy, the spirit of what God is saying there to Daniel and saying, hey, look out for these earthly kingdoms. They're going to be toppled by this big stone that gets hurled at them, right? That's Christ eventually. Or, depending on how you read that, you can actually read that a few different ways. I'm not going to get into that now. But God also is warning Daniel, say, hey, these types of earthly empires and governments, regardless of what form they take, beware, right? So yes, I think it has that immediate kind of historicity, but it also still has a lesson for us to learn as readers who've happened after that. Great question, yeah. What else? Okay, Carolyn, can we get, Mickey, can you give Carolyn that mic?
So in Revelation, it seems to be building to a climax.
Yes.
And I know when we read Revelation, it's not chronological. We talked about that.
Yeah, it's not chronological.
And so in John's time, there had been evil empires.
Yes.
He was living in an evil empire, and we can argue about what's been evil between then and now, or what we think is evil today. But it's a cycle that's ongoing. Mm-hmm. But in Revelations, it builds to a climax.
Did you just say Revelations?
I'm sorry. In Revelation, it builds to a climax. Don't lecture me. It's not been a
coronary.
Good day.
Okay, so you're in Revelation, it's building to a climax.
It builds to a climax. But in real life, or in history and what's going forward, these empires just keep going and going. Yeah. So should we expect a climax, or is it just at some point?
At some point,
he's just going to appear.
At some point, yeah. So, great point that she made. Let me speak to the first thing that she said, and then I'll kind of close out with answering your question. Revelation is not. When she said it's not chronological, what we meant by that. So she did the word and worship study. You don't start in chapter 1, page 1 of Revelation, and then everything just kind of happens in sequential order. Especially when you get to like the scroll, like the seals and the bowls and like all these things. Like a lot of a better way maybe of understanding that I find a better way of understanding Revelation. Again, if you don't agree with me, that's fine. That's your prerogative. It's not going to hurt my feelings. Is more of like concentric circles that are all kind of happening at the same time, and there's like 3 different ways of saying the same thing and of highlighting different aspects about those things, like the seals and the bowls and the trumpets. Are some scholars, I put myself in this group, think that those are more like concentric circles happening at the same time rather than like having like basically 21 different events, because you have 3 sets of 7, right? 3 and 7 are great biblical numbers, and the authors of the Bible just go gaga over them. Rightfully so, because they help get things in our brains, right? And people kind of pay attention. So that's what she means when she says it's not like you don't start with like the seals and then like, then we have this, the bowls, and we have the trumpets, and we have this. I think that they're more of saying, here's kind of a different spin on that, and also you should pay attention. Again, we could argue that, but again, if you don't agree, that's totally fine. But to your point, Carolyn, about, like, we're living in a world filled with evil worldly systems now. We're living, in this place. The message of Revelation is, one of the main messages of Revelation is endure, right? Faithfulness, endurance of the saints, being wise. We read this, this calls for wisdom. This revelation, this apocalypse that we have received, it calls for wisdom. Why? Because we still find ourselves in the same type of situation as John and his readers and his hearers, where we're just surrounded by systems of evil, right? We're just living in a world that's just like just awash with all of this stuff. And so the message of Revelation is, yes, Jesus will come back and set things right. God will set up his kingdom here on earth, heaven and earth. You guys wrote some great things about like the kingdom of heaven this week. It was fantastic. I was so encouraged reading that. For those of you who talked about that. But God's space and human space will finally ultimately overlap and become one, as it was like in the garden and is supposed to have been. And we've had like kind of like whisperings of it through the temple and stuff like that. So yeah, eventually, I don't know that Revelation is pointing towards like some like, again, if we could just get to this point in history, then like something would trigger. I don't think that's what Revelation is saying, but I think it is saying, hey, this is the way the world is bent on going until like things are set right. Like evil systems, evil governments, evil empires will continue to run and rule and be powered by and energized by the spirit of the dragon and the beasts. So pay attention, stay awake, be alert, be faithful in the face of this. As Christians, we're called to live differently, even though we are in the midst of this, right? Yes. Okay. Other comments, questions? Yes, Mickey, and then we'll come over here.
Yeah, just hearing you talk, and I wrote this to you in my question or my reflection. You know, I've been raised in a capitalist system. I've benefited and been blessed by that, but it's still Babylon.
Sure. Yeah.
And so the thinking I'm going to trust in that or have faith in that, that's exactly what we were saying earlier. I shouldn't be looking to capitalism. You know, again, I've benefited from
sure,
that.
And
I've had
we
the
all
whole
in this room
career
have.
in that, but it's still Babylon.
Yeah, it's not going to save you, right? We make idols out of these things. Like only Jesus will save you. Only the kingdom of God will endure, right? None of our earthly kingdoms, none of our earthly governments will endure. So we need to make sure that our ultimate allegiance, ultimate hope, right? Ultimate security, like you were talking about, is in the kingdom of God and not in any earthly system, not in, what we can concoct for ourselves or in our build, safety for ourselves, because it will all crumble. Revelation warns us of this, right? But that's a great point.
Well, and to be honest, I struggle with that.
Oh, we all do. Like that's the great temptation, right? Like that's why Revelation is saying, pay attention. Don't live the way this world lives. You are called to live differently. You're called to put your faith and your hope in something other than the systems of the world, right? Which is so hard for us. I mean, we fight this daily. Yeah, David.
The symptoms, the symbolism in Revelation, and we're studying Isaiah.
Yes.
And so there are symbolisms in Isaiah that now they're much gentler.
Right.
The lion lays down with the lamb.
You're like, please, Lord.
But I mean, there's also these
yes.
things that are being damned and woes and
yes.
stuff like that. But how does the apocalypse differ from the poetic prophets'
sure.
statements?
Great
because
question.
I'm seeing a lot of similarities here.
Yes.
But
yes.
they're not apocalyptic.
They're not apocalyptic. Great question. Sometimes they are. Like in Daniel. Like Daniel goes from like narrative and history, prophecy, and then like a few verses of apocalyptic style, and you're like back to narrative, right? So you kind of Daniel is a very odd book. It's hard. Like we are like Daniel's great. Daniel and Lion's Den, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We got like they're in exile. They like won't eat the food. They just want to be like vegetarians for a few days. Like we get like like those are the stories we know, but we miss the prophetic kind of spirit of Daniel. Sometimes we miss the apocalyptic spirit of Daniel. Similar to books like Isaiah. Where you do have, in some ways, Isaiah 6 is very apocalyptic in tone. Because what's happening in Isaiah 6? Isaiah 6 is giving us a vision. It's giving us a curtain peeled back picture into the throne room of God, into the way things actually are. This is Isaiah 6. In the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lofty in the temple. His train of his robe filled the temple, and there was smoke and fire and all this stuff, right? And you have these three six-winged creatures, and like with 2 wings they covered their face, with 2 wings they covered their feet, with 2 wings they flew, and they're shouting, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. Heaven and earth are full of his glory. And Isaiah says, woe to me, I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. I'm literally about to get burned up right now because I'm in the presence of God, right? and then the seraphim takes the coal. So you're getting this like apocalyptic picture, because remember, apocalyptic just says pulling back the veil and kind of seeing into God's space, seeing what God is doing. So Isaiah even sometimes like will bounce back and forth, but you're talking about like these poetic kind of beautiful passages in Isaiah. Jeremiah even has a few, where you get kind of this language that's very stark sometimes, again, that's very kind of like, again, jarring language. Sometimes it's just poetry. It's just prophetic poetry. Again, the prophets are really good at using imagery to kind of grab us and say, pay attention. Again, all of this is saying, pay attention, stay awake, pay attention, all of these things, right? Be alert, be faithful, faithfulness in the face of a wicked and perverse world. But Isaiah is very poetic in how he uses that. He doesn't really jump over to apocalyptic language a whole lot, but the poetry of Isaiah, the prophetic poetry of Isaiah and some of the other prophets, again, I would argue, or just say, we don't have to argue, I would say that it also serves a similar purpose in saying, hey, pay attention, right? This is how God actually sees things. This is how God's plane, heaven, operates. And if you'll pay attention, you'll notice how heaven and earth just continually overlap and like pass through each other and overlap. And just as Christians, our goal is to bring heaven to earth through the Spirit, through what Christ has done, right? And Isaiah and other prophets are saying, hey, if you will reject the systems of the world, if you'll push those off to the side and remain faithful to God, that gap becomes much, much, much smaller, right? I can't remember, who's the writer who talks about those as the thin places, which I think is a great way of talking about that, where heaven and earth just kind of like, they're like thin places. And I feel like we've all experienced this before, where you've just felt like you've sensed something like God's doing something, or I'm like awakened to something about God, or I'm sensing the Spirit doing something, or I'm even in moments of worship, even just moments of your daily life where you're just like, man, I really sense God's presence with me in that moment, like just those thin places, right? But the prophets do this a lot, talking about what does it look like? What does God's kingdom look like? What does the kingdoms of the world look like? And they use some pretty harsh language to juxtapose those, even in poetic places. So yeah, it's great. Catherine, can you get Catherine a mic?
I might be misunderstanding it, but I'm trying to understand it better.
That's how we all are,
Okay.
all the time.
So the apocalyptic is the great reveal.
Yeah, that's a great way of saying it.
How would that, like, other than the jarring terminology, like, I'm not forming this right, but like contemplatives will paint a picture of the great reveal, not very jarring, and it's not apocalyptic. Like, can you put into words like that difference between, like, maybe is it because they talk about how God feels or what they see? You see what I mean? Like,
you're talking like contemplatives, like Christian mystics who I love and just have learned so much from. Are you talking about how people who are more in that vein and that kind of stream of Christianity talk about those thin places, talk about heaven, earth being, like that? Okay.
Yeah, they're like revelatory, but they're not
Sure.
It's not the same,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
I don't understand that word to do the difference.
Sure. So I think part of that is when you talk about contemplatives or Christian mystics or monastic communities, places like that. A lot of when they talk about experiences with God in those thin places, right, where you sense something different, where it almost just smells like home, right, and you're like, the kingdom came near, like you feel that, right? They talk about that as more of born out of their personal experiences, right? You think of like the great mystics of the past, like Teresa of Avila is one of them. She's been dead for many, 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 many centuries now. But she's the one who said, all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well, right? And she's talking about what does it mean when God comes near? What does it mean when the kingdom? And I don't think she would use these words because she was living like in medieval times, right? But what does it look like when the kingdom comes near? And the way she explained it was all shall be well. And all manner of things shall be well, right? So when the mystics and when some of the Christian contemplatives talk about it, I think a lot of the reason they use the language they do is because they're writing about their own experiences that are very personal to them, or even communal to that specific monastery or convent or group of people, right? And so when John is writing, and they usually aren't, they are in some ways a little subversive because they're passing, judgment, much like John is, on the systems of this world. But their purpose behind it is not to jar everyone awake and to jar an entire people group awake, where John is writing to, the churches on behalf of Jesus and all this stuff. Their purpose is just saying, hey, here's how God showed up. And it doesn't look anything like the way the world does, right? So I think that's why you have that difference, because John is writing to people in the midst of persecution, or in the midst of people who are about to face persecution, in the midst of a hostile world, and saying, hey, let me encourage you, let me bolster you up, let me remind you to worship only the Lamb, let me remind you of all these things. And whereas Christian contemplatives and mystics are writing more about their personal experience, which is wonderful, and you should read those books, like just soul expanding. But I think that's why we get some of the difference in tone.
If Moses or Elijah, because of their actual, seeing, if you will, of God, if they were to write about seeing God, even though it's personal, would it be considered apocalyptic? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Versus
I don't know, because it's not necessarily, apocalyptic is like, it's a genre, right? So to write about your experiences with God is not apocalyptic, right? It's narrative, or it's poetry, or however that would come out of your soul, right? Apocalyptic literature it functions for a specific purpose, again, of typically, at least in our scriptures, of God revealing and peeling back the curtain and unveiling something and saying, hey, let me pull back like all of just the mess that's like on your eyes because of the way this world operates, and let me like pull it back so you can like peek into the kingdom of heaven. So you can peek into how God actually sees the world. So yeah, I don't think that it would be apocalyptic in that way. To write about your experiences with God is not apocalyptic. It's more of there's more to the genre than that. It's a little deeper than that. Yeah. Yes. We're just going to pass the mic around. Great questions. Do we have Abel, are the mics on? Can you just leave them on? Yeah, thank you. Oh, it's good. We're good. We're going to make it work. Thank you, everyone.
I had a question about Mr. Mephistopheles. It seems like we did away with him pretty quickly there. And so what we're saying is that the beast and what's under the beast? Beast is on top of the
dragon.
The
then
dragon
the empire beast
is a personification of that, kind of evil, all kind of personified.
Uh-huh.
But we're not trying to do away with the fallen angel, or Christ says he saw Satan, capital S, fall from the sky like a lightning bolt. So we kind of still have that out there. We're just saying it's really not in this part of Revelation we're talking about.
Yeah,
Is that
I would
right,
just
or no?
encourage you. I can't go unpack all those verses right now.
Yeah, I know.
I would encourage you to go read 2 or 3 commentaries on all of those places, and realize that it doesn't have to mean what we've always thought it meant. I don't have time to unpack Satan right now. I can't believe I just said that. But yeah, no, you make a good point. But I would encourage you, if that's something that you want to kind of explore, but I would encourage you, hey, go look at commentaries. I would say 3 or 4. And I would encourage you also to purposely look for commentaries or just thoughts from a Jewish standpoint, because they have some. Because again, we're using their scriptures, like that's our Old Testament, right? So we should listen to them when they expound on it, because they know some things. But go read 3 or 4 commentaries about some of those verses and see how they take that, because there are multiple ways to exegete those passages that move, I think, to a better place than like some capital S actual figure. But again, I'm not trying to convince you of my position. I'm just saying, hey, there's other options out there. There's more ways that we should be aware of. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great question. Yes, Tom, do we have a microphone over here? There we go. Mickey, sleep on the job.
I think there's probably few or none of us in here that would say that what we've read in Revelation is not weird.
Right. Oh, definitely.
But to be jarring apocalyptic literature, it doesn't have to be weird, does it? And maybe for the sake of argument, could someone say the story of the Garden of Eden is apocalyptic literature?
No, I know what you're saying. I'm tracking 100% with you.
Wait, what did he just say?
Repeat what you just said.
Well, I was wondering if, I don't know if apocalyptic literature has to be weird.
Yeah.
And so I was just saying, for the sake of argument, so could someone look at the story of the Garden of Eden and say that's just symbolic and apocalyptic literature? I'm having trouble with the word.
Sure. No, I think I know where you're going. I'm tracking with you. So generally speaking, apocalyptic literature is pretty weird. Your textbook mentioned there are actually several other Jewish apocalyptic writings that we have around this time, like 4 Enoch, other books. They're all pretty intense. Like the writing in them is similar to what we get in Revelation, because that's just the style of apocalypse. That's just what apocalyptic literature is in many ways. So Revelation is not uncommon in that we actually have several other Jewish documents from this time that are very similar to Revelation, actually, that have the same type of imagery, same type of language about things. Again, that jarring kind of thing. To your point about Eden, about Genesis 1 through 2, I would not call that apocalyptic for many reasons. The word that maybe some people use for it is myth, right? Is Christian myth. Some of you just had a coronary. It's okay. Just take a deep breath. But yeah, there are Jesus-loving, Bible-teaching, solid biblical scholars out there who are very comfortable taking even actually Genesis probably 1 through 12 and viewing it through the lens of Christian myth. Myth does not mean something is not true. That's not what they mean by that. But that is a different type of literature than say what we get to when we get to the Abrahamic narrative and stuff like that. So yeah, there are people who would agree with what you're unpacking. I would not call it apocalyptic. No one, I don't think anyone else would. But the word that would be used would be more like Christian myth. Yeah.
Well, when I think of chapter 5, the heartbeat or the centerpiece, the image of heaven, God dwelling amongst us.
Yes.
I think of the Garden of Eden in that situation very similarly.
Yeah, and that's what you should think of. Again, Revelation is a very Old Testament book. It is drawing back to pictures of Genesis 1 through 2. It's drawing back to the story of the Exodus. It's drawing back to the prophets. It's drawing back to the praise of the Psalms. It has everything in it, right? It's kind of, again, the telos, the end purpose, the end goal of where the whole thing is going. So all of that's those stories. But it's very Edenic, that's the word, that's the fancy word. But it should point us back to Eden, this idea of God dwelling with God's people, which should point us to the tabernacle, which should point us to the temple, which should point us to this idea of God always, 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 through the scriptures, is telling us, I desire to put my presence down amongst my people and to dwell with them. I will be their God, they will be my people. This is the pinnacle of Revelation. This is where we get to the end of Revelation, and you have the new heavens and the new earth, and God comes down, and you see this beautiful, symbolic city where we actually, get God's presence coming to dwell, and the sea is no more, and we don't even need a sun anymore because God's presence will be our light. All these types of, intense imagery, right, should point us back to God dwelling with Adam and Eve in the garden, right? And Eden is actually a very garden-esque city, right? There's a beautiful river running through it, just like we had in the Garden of Eden. There's a lot of similar imagery. So you're exactly right that you're thinking back towards Eden as you read through Revelation, especially towards the end of Revelation where things get much better, right? No more beasts. no more strange creatures. Does someone else? Yes, can we get a mic over here? Thank you all for helping shuffle those around.
This just kind of plays on his question. Would you expound on what myth is, if it is real?
Oh, that's a big question that we could do a whole session on. So let me do this. I'll do a quick, just real quick, and then I'll post some podcasts that are really helpful and kind of for people who have questions about this. You don't have to believe this. That's fine. But just know that there are people who you probably go to church with who think this way, and that's totally fine too. So when we talk about Christian myth, we don't mean that that the message of the story isn't true. We don't mean that like, oh, it was just like kind of like, I'll just write whatever I want. But that, there are a lot of people, again, Bible reading, Jesus loving Christians who don't think Adam and Eve were actual real people, right? Okay? Totally fine. It's going to be fine, I promise. But they think that what we get in Genesis 1 through 2 and 3 especially is a theocentric, is a God-centered way of God's people explaining how the world came to be, how evil entered the world, how things are meant to be, and how things are broken, right? Because all the other cultures of the day had their creation story. They had their creation myths. They had their tellings of how things came to be, right? And in some ways, the biblical story, especially once we get to the flood and the Tower of Babel, is very, very similar to other accounts that we get from other cultures, right? So some people, biblical scholars, Christians, people in churches, whatever, read it more in that way. Again, it's totally fine. People love Jesus and think this way, and we don't need to like argue and like have like just like division over it, which is so sad when that happens to me. But let me post some articles and podcasts for those of you who are interested in like learning more about people who think that way, just to kind of learn, like, oh, this is out there. Like that's another thing that again, people who love Jesus, who read the Bible and believe all the things that you do about like Jesus and what's going on, think that way. So I'll post those for those of you who are interested. Some of you are like, that doesn't interest me at all. That's totally fine. Yes. You're good.
So if you're taking that view, that is that it's myth, I mean, what do you do with the genealogy in Luke that goes all the way back to Adam?
Yeah.
I mean, it starts sounding like the Jeffersonian Bible where, the stuff you don't like, you just clip out.
Yeah. Well, the biblical writer in Luke did, because that genealogy is not like straight through. Like they skip a lot. Like they kind of like, really, they do. They skip quite a bit and kind of pack in some holes if you read some commentaries on that. I don't have time to go into all that right now. Like we got like, I want to focus on Revelation. I will post podcasts and other things for y'all to do your own learning and own research and on everything. If you have further questions about that, once you've kind of learned some stuff about it, I'm happy to continue that dialogue. But I don't want to use the last 8 minutes we have to talk about that. I want to talk about Revelation. So, okay, let's go here and then over here.
Okay, I'll make it quick. You already referenced there's all these other references in our textbook to 4 Ezra and 2 Baruch and all.
Yeah.
So 2 questions about that. One, are they similar in the sense, not necessarily all the imagery, but are they trying to convey a similar message as Revelation?
Yeah.
And then secondly, I mean, maybe the answer to this is just it was only God knows, but why not have more of that in the Bible? Like we have 4 Gospels.
Yeah, why not have more of the stories?
Why don't we have more of this?
Okay, so first question. They are similar in that they are apocalyptic in tone. As far as overall message, it's been a long time since I've read either of them, so I don't feel overly confident in answering, like, are they pointing to the same direction? Because I haven't read 4 Baruch in probably like 5 years. Like I read it in grad school and I don't remember some of it. You can read them though. Like you can go find them. And so I don't feel confident enough in answering that, but what I do feel confident enough in answering is they carry this very common apocalyptic style of writing that John used. John wasn't the only author who used this style. It was very common in Jewish society and kind of that group back then. I'm pretty confident in saying, yes, there's some similar kind of messaging in them, but I don't remember if they have like similar images or that type of stuff. Like I said, it's been a while since I've read them. But your other question about why are they not in the Bible really comes down to kind of what we've explored earlier is authorship, kind of questions about that. Do they have kind of like an apostle or someone close to an apostle's like stamp? What was the dating? Did they happen too late? That type of stuff. Some of them Revelation almost didn't make it in. Like it was like by the skin of its teeth, like maybe made it in. Martin Luther hated Revelation. John Calvin didn't write a commentary on it. So Protestants are not very great with Revelation. Like historically, we just kind of were like, but the other ones, the other apocalypses, for those kind of reasons, dating, authorship, that type of stuff just didn't make it in when they canonized everything. So that's where that is. So. Baruch is in there, but I don't think I don't know that all of those are in there. Not all the apocalypses are in the Apocrypha and other pseudepigrapha and stuff. Joy.
Can you? Okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. Is Revelation, you're talking about Baruch and Ezra and all those having similar apocalyptic literature that's sort of a similar message maybe? Okay, so is this similar to what the Jews believe about going to heaven or heaven coming to us? Excuse me. Mm-hmm. How do they see it in relation to Revelation?
Sure. They don't. Really. Revelation is a very Christian book. It's a very Christ-centered, theocentric, God-centered text. So as far as the message of Revelation, the overall message of Revelation doesn't really exist in a Jewish setting because it is Christocentric. It is Christ-centered, right? Remember, the heartbeat is chapter 5, really of showing us who is at the center of all these things, the Lamb, Jesus. So yeah, it doesn't fit that type of vibe, really. That's a terrible word to use, but that's the word that came out of my mouth. It doesn't fit that kind of vibe for now. You do have Jewish apocalyptic writing around this time, like these other books that use the same imagery. You have the same kind of, again, like grandiose, like jarring kind of imagery to talk about, world events or to talk about things like that. But they're not pointing towards an end of Jesus being kind of the center, right? They're not pointing towards an end of some type of what we get in like Revelation 20, 21, 22. Or, I'm sorry, 22. They don't have that focus because they're not Christocentric. They're not.
But they're looking for the Messiah.
Kind of, yeah. The Old Testament does a lot of looking for the Messiah. So a lot of what you get in apocalyptic literature from some of these other authors is social commentary, again, kind of, which is what Revelation is in some ways. It's social commentary, it's commentary on worldly government, it's commentary on worldly empires, which you get in some of the Jewish, because remember, they were oppressed as well, right? They're under Roman oppression, they're experiencing this. So you get some of that, but you don't really get like kind of, again, the telos, the end of things in the way we get in Revelation. Yeah. Catherine.
Okay, so I get why you say Revelation isn't dualistic with good and evil, like in the sense of two, because it's not like a Marvel movie with the good guy and the bad guy.
Exactly.
It's like there's the good guy, and then there's like all the little other people that are trying to chip away at his goodness. Mm-hmm. Would that be fair? And he just kind of smushes them in the end. And then, but would you say, I mean, it seems like in so much of the writing in the Bible, though, it is dualistic with light and darkness. And, I'm not listing all of them, but it.
Sure.
So would you say that in some ways Plato did us a favor with that, or is it because we tend to think there's only two all the time that it's the problem?
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Sure. This whole, like, the other thing that dualism does to us is it kind of convinces us that, like, heaven is good and earth is bad, right? And that, like, there's these two types of systems, and, like, flesh is bad and spirit is good. That's Platonic dualism, like, par excellence, right? So that's where it begins to really seep in, and we begin to somehow, even in our preaching and in our Bible studies, become convinced just throughout, especially Western evangelical Christianity, that, like, the flesh is bad, the spirit is good, like, all these things. And that's not the story of the Bible. Like, if we just escape, like, this earthly, like, shackles and, like, get to heaven or something like that, then things would be right. That's not the story. But we do get these images of, light and darkness, things like that. But it's never, like, I would argue that it's never, like, pitting them against each other in this, like, but what's going to happen? Like, I don't know who's going to win today. And even things like light and darkness. I mean, you can get really, like, philosophical about, darkness is simply the absence of light, right? And once we introduce light into it, there is no more darkness. So yeah, the Bible definitely gives us imagery to kind of understand the systems of this world as anti-God. But I don't know that it's ever like, it's never like, but who's going to win? Like, it's not like these dueling forces, like, battling it over, out, and, like, it's not that. Jesus is on the throne, and Jesus has won. It's never the story of, like an Avenger movie. Like, it's never like, oh, I don't know, like, who's going to win? Like, is there going to be, like, some resolution? And so if we can start kind of lessening that imagery and thought as we approach the scriptures, I think it's helpful to us. Otherwise, sometimes we get caught up in, like, heaven is good, earth is bad, flesh is bad, spirit is good, which I think we'll probably touch on more in the theology unit, because Platonic dualism just pops up everywhere. Everywhere. Gnosticism plays into this as well. So we'll talk about that a lot, I'm sure. Okay, we're at time. That was very fast. That like flew by. So I'm sorry if we didn't touch on what you came here tonight to hear. I would encourage you, if you have questions about Revelation, go watch the Revelation lectures. You can find them on YouTube. You can find them on MDPC's website. If you have a question about a specific chapter, like go in Revelation. Hopefully that will be helpful to you. Next week, pay attention. Next week, we do not meet in this room. We meet in the CLC in the high school room. I'll put it on an email, but just kind of planting a little seed in our brains now, because Summer Cell will have just full reign of our campus. We praise God. But we'll be up over there, and that's when Clay is going to talk to us about the covenants and dispensationalism and all that. It'll be fascinating. I promise you it's going to be really interesting. Come to that. Thank you all. Let me pray for us, and then we'll get out of here. God, thank you so much for just great conversation and great questions, and just friends to deeply and thoughtfully consider the things of God with. I'm grateful for these people. Would you get us all home safely? It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.